Sometimes, many times actually, I feel overwhelmed by the number of media items that relate to women, including the treatment of women in society and women's rights. There are issues that relate to men and boys, of course, but my focus for today is on women and girls. As I talk about women's rights, it is important to note that there is no single or universal definition of women or women's experience. It's important to note that women have different experiences, and we need to also be conscious of the impact of the intersection of racism and sexism and classism and ableism on any individual woman's experience. Feminism. You've all heard the word, and you've likely heard multiple definitions of the word. One definition, of course, is that feminists are a group of man-hating, bra-burning activists. But there are other definitions. Bell Hooks, for example, is an acclaimed academic, feminist theorist, author, and artist. And she strives to bridge the racial, cultural, and gender divide. She said that to be a feminist in the authentic sense of the term is to want for all people, men and women, liberation from sexist role patterns, domination, and oppression. So if in its simplest term, feminism is about liberation and equality, what then makes the word so misunderstood? I recently had a conversation with a former neighbor. I told him about changing careers, and he seemed quite interested, until I told him I was teaching a feminist perspectives course. And then it started. His eyes started to glaze over, and he got one of those really artificial smiles, you know, the type that goes to the mouth but really stops at the cheekbones and never quite reaches the eyes? I know the look. I've seen it before when I talk about feminism. So he hesitated and he looked at me and he said, okay, I understand. We need to talk about men and women separately because of all of the issues facing women right now. But when will we be able to talk about men and women collectively as a single group? My immediate thought was, happening right now? What do you mean happening right now? What is happening right now is that women have chosen to join collective forces and challenge the sexual harassment and inequality and sexist language that has been devaluing and shaming women for a long period of time. I thought of the first Women's March, a worldwide global movement in support of women's equality, and changes to policies and legislation in relation to women. But few seem to know that it's also related to healthcare reform and immigration reform and racial equality. Why is that? The second Women's March was another global movement in support of women's empowerment. But I also thought back to the 2011 Slut Walk movement, when a Toronto City police officer said to a group of university students, women should not dress like sluts if they want to avoid being victimized. After blaming women's clothing as a cause for rape, university students decided to join forces and challenge that notion, that violence and that clothing was a cause of violence. So as I think about the women's movement and the women's marches, I think about the word feminism. Feminism is a word that actually has negative connotations and has had negative connotations for a very long time. The word was first coined in the 1890s, and it appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary at about that same time. It was coined, in fact, to talk about women's legal and political rights. Now, historians typically talk about feminism in distinct waves of thought and patterns. The first wave of feminism was in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it focused on legal and political rights and suffrage for white, middle-class, Western women. At the time, tea parties and posters were the method through which women sought to recruit others. Needless to say, things didn't happen quickly. The second wave of feminism was in the 60s and 70s, and it sought to broaden the conversation related to women. The focus was on the discrimination in society in general, in education, and in the workplace. Some of you may in fact have read this book. The third wave of feminism started in about the 1990s. Rebecca Walker coined the phrase, "I am the third wave." Now, it started in response to what was the perceived failures of the second wave of feminism. But it started to expand the conversation by talking about gender and sexuality and heteronormativity. The fourth wave is the current wave. And women are using technology now in different ways to recruit others to talk about the issues happening to women in society right now. But as I was having my own internal conversation, I remembered that I was in fact having a conversation with my neighbor. So I looked at him and said, well, I believe we can talk about men and women collectively when the gender pay gap no longer exists, when the healthcare gap no longer exists, when immigrant women and Indigenous women and women from cultural minorities are no longer discriminated against because of who they are. You may imagine. He looked at me and his eyes became even more glazed. And then he looked at me and said, oh, my wife, she's over there, she's waving at me. I'm sorry, I have to go. I really wanted to have this conversation right now, but we'll have to do it at another time. As I watched him walk away, I thought, no, don't walk away from me. I want to have this conversation right now, not later. But he was gone. I felt so cheated. It's happened before, of course. Conversations that challenge gender norms result in resistance. By putting off the conversation, changing the topic, or as happened that day, by walking away. But we need to find a way to start and have those difficult conversations. We could start with a documentary, like the one that uncovered sexual assault of immigrant women working the night shift in the janitorial field. Or what about the one that looks at rape on college campuses? We could also look at one that explores the complexities of sexuality. A social psychologist did a research study, and she talked to young women. Young women reported that they often engaged in sexual behavior, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't want to hurt the ego of the fellow they were with. So the fellow's ego became the overriding factor in their decision to have sex, rather than their own needs. We need to look at the socialization of our children, and how men and women later understand relationships. As I think of those issues, the issues really relate to one of the key factors related to women right now, and that's violence against women. According to the Canadian Women's Foundation in 2018, young women aged 15 to 24 experience dating violence at a rate 6 times that of young men. 47% of crimes committed against girls under 12 are sexual crimes. 60% of women with disabilities experience violence. Indigenous women experience violence at a rate 2.5 times that of the general population. And a Canadian researcher recently found that cyberbullying-related suicides are on the rise. So for those who think that feminism has no place today, I and the stats disagree. Technology has created new challenges and realities today, but new or old, there continue to exist issues for women. When I first graduated from the University of Manitoba, I was determined to change the world. Now, I didn't quite know what that meant, but I was determined. I started my career in adult corrections, assisting federal offenders to successfully reintegrate into society. Shortly after I started, one of my male colleagues lamented the fact that he had been assigned a female parolee to supervise. He said, I hate supervising female offenders. They have so many issues and they cry all the time. Now, I hadn't yet supervised a female offender, so I didn't really know the depth of what he was talking about. And then I started to supervise women offenders, and I realized they had many unique and different experiences that men did not. And then, about 6 months into my career, I got tired of being called dear by a number of the middle-aged correctional officers in the prisons I visited. At one point, I'd had enough. So I looked at the officer and I said, I am not your dear. I don't appreciate you calling me that, so please don't call me that again. Now you may imagine, he looked at me and laughed. He did, however, call me at my office later that day and apologize. It was at that moment that I claimed my feminist label. I knew I needed to if I had any hope of being successful in a largely patriarchal environment. So as I think about the experiences of women offenders and women in general, I think of Kurt Cobain. Now, he is not a person I ever thought I would be quoting. However, he did once say, Rape is one of the most terrible crimes on earth, and it happens every minute. The problem with groups who deal with rape is that they try and educate women how to defend themselves. What they need to do is teach men not to rape. Go to the source and start there. I agree. So let's look at our role in the socialization of our children. For example, I believe we need to focus on enhancing self-worth, not self-esteem. Because if we tell our children they are the smartest or fastest or funniest, what happens then? It backfires when someone smarter or faster or funnier arrives on the scene. Our children need to know they're loved for who they are, not for what they do. And what about those ever-present thumbs up and thumbs down signs, and the impact of living one's life by counting the number of both? Or what about the role of women in music videos and video games? These are all the issues I discuss in my class and more. Many of my students tell me they had no idea about the depth and breadth of issues related to women. One year, I had a student come bounding into class. She was so excited. In anticipation of the media assignment, she decided to take pictures of the writing on the wall in the women's washroom. And as she started to read the writing, she was horrified by what she saw. So she went home and told her boyfriend. The boyfriend agreed. He was going to read the writing in the men's washroom. And he did. And he was also horrified. So they started a conversation about that. And I thought, that's perfect, a conversation. There was also a conversation that was started by a student who came into class to talk about the fact that a judge had made comments about a sexual assault victim in his court. Another student came to class to talk about the impact of that famous father figure who was charged and convicted of sexual assault. So conversations are important. They allow things to happen. As I think of feminism, feminism needs to stand for more than women's rights, because it really is about human rights. But I believe feminism is about more than that. I believe feminism starts for focus and flexibility and freedom and future. So I invite you all to join in the conversation, however that works for you, whether it is watching a documentary, whether it's attending a women's march. Now I know, it's always easy to say, I'm too busy. I was too busy to attend the first women's march, but I knew I needed to attend the second one. My husband and I joined, and we found it exciting and energizing and emotional. And one fellow there had this written on a placard that he was carrying. I agree. So again, let's get involved. Let's talk about a conversation and how we can be involved in the conversation. Sometimes it's about Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is that works for you. What is important is that we have the conversation. Or, anyone here involved in a book club? Okay. What about an issues club, where we agree, men and women, to talk about a key issue related to women? It might be modern-day slavery, or what we know as human trafficking. It could also be the unequal availability of education for women and girls around the world. I met these two young ladies in a visit to Ghana, West Africa. They told me the family decided there was no point in them getting an education, so set them off to work at a very young age. Neither saw any hope for change in their life. There are two things that guide the work that I do. This quote is one of them, because I believe we can make change if we let our voices be heard. And I think of this quote in relation to the question I was asked by my former neighbor: when will we be able to talk about men and women collectively as one? I think the answer is simple: when the work is done. But I have this in my office as well, Wonder Woman. My daughter gave this to me. She said, "Mom, she's just like you." So when I'm asked the question, why am I a feminist? The answer is also simple: because I need to be. Thank you.